It was a warm Sunday afternoon in the small town of Pine Ridge, nestled in the heart of America's Midwest. The air was heavy with the scent of fresh grass and the distant hum of crickets, a typical quiet day in this sleepy town. Pine Ridge was known for its tight-knit community, where everyone knew each other's business. But no one ever dared to dig too deep into the secrets buried beneath the surface. For James Thompson, a 29-year-old mechanic, life had been good. He had just married the love of his life, Sarah, only 6 months ago. She was everything he had ever wanted: kind, beautiful, and devoted. They had met at a local coffee shop, and after a whirlwind romance, they were wed in a small church ceremony. Sarah had always been the perfect wife, sweet, obedient, and seemingly devoted to their life together. James was a simple man, working hard to provide for his new family, while Sarah stayed home, tending to the house and occasionally volunteering at the local church. Their relationship, though short, was marked by happiness, and James was content. Little did he know that the perfect life he had imagined was about to unravel in the most shocking of ways. It all started on a quiet Sunday, the same day they usually went to church. After a long week of work, James was looking forward to a peaceful afternoon. But that morning, Sarah had seemed a bit off. She was distant, distracted, and had mentioned that she needed to speak with Pastor Michael after the service. Pastor Michael was a well-respected figure in the community, a man who had been there for James and Sarah since their early days together. James didn't think much of it. After all, Sarah had always been involved in church activities. However, as the service came to an end and people were beginning to filter out of the pews, James noticed something strange. He had left the church to head to their car when he saw Sarah and Pastor Michael walking toward the back of the church. At first, he thought nothing of it. Perhaps they were discussing church business. But then curiosity got the better of him. James decided to take a shortcut through the church's side entrance, planning to surprise Sarah with a quick kiss before they left. But as he walked down the narrow hallway that led to the back office, he froze in his tracks. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack, he could see the unmistakable figure of his wife, Sarah, and Pastor Michael. But what he saw next would haunt him for the rest of his life. Through the gap in the door, he saw Sarah on her knees, her head lowered as Pastor Michael stood over her. The scene was nothing like James had ever imagined. His heart stopped as his mind raced to make sense of what he was witnessing. The man he had trusted, the man who had counseled him through difficult times, was now taking advantage of his wife. James could barely comprehend the betrayal that was unfolding in front of him. The world seemed to tilt as a wave of anger, humiliation, and disbelief washed over him. His grip on the door frame tightened as he struggled to stay upright. The emotions swirling inside him, hurt, rage, and confusion, fought for dominance. He felt a surge of adrenaline as the instinct to confront them overwhelmed him. But something held him back. His feet felt like lead as he remained frozen in place, unable to tear his eyes away from the horrifying scene. For what felt like an eternity, James stood there, watching in silence, unable to speak or move. Finally, when his mind cleared just enough to think, the weight of what was happening hit him like a freight train. His wife, the woman he had given his heart to, was betraying him in the worst possible way. And the man he had trusted more than anyone else had been complicit in the affair. The door creaked as it shifted slightly, drawing the attention of Pastor Michael and Sarah. Their eyes met, and in that instant, everything changed. Sarah's face went pale as she realized James had seen everything. She stood up quickly, her hands trembling as she adjusted her clothes, trying to make sense of the situation. Pastor Michael, too, appeared flustered, though his reaction was more composed, as if he had been caught doing something he had done countless times before. James didn't speak. He didn't know what to say. His mouth was dry, and the words he wanted to say wouldn't come. He turned on his heel and walked away, his mind a blur of emotions. As he left the church, the sounds of the bustling congregation seemed distant, as though the world around him had ceased to exist. All he could hear was the pounding of his own heartbeat. The drive home was a blur, but James couldn't shake the image of Sarah and Pastor Michael from his mind. The betrayal was too much to bear. He couldn't understand how Sarah could do this to him, how she could throw away everything they had built together. He had always trusted her. He had always believed in her. And now that trust was shattered beyond repair. As the hours passed, James wrestled with his emotions, trying to come to terms with what he had seen. But no matter how much he tried, he couldn't stop the thoughts that consumed him. The rage burned deep inside, threatening to overtake him at every turn. The more he thought about the betrayal, the more he realized that he needed to do something about it. He couldn't let this go unpunished. And so a plan began to form in his mind. A plan to get revenge. Revenge that would shock everyone. Little did James know, his next actions would set in motion a chain of events that would change the lives of everyone involved. And though he thought he had it all figured out, the truth was much darker and more complicated than he could have ever imagined. The discovery was just the beginning. James couldn't sit still. His mind raced as he paced around the small living room of their house, running over every detail of what he had witnessed. Sarah's face haunted him, but what disturbed him even more was Pastor Michael's calm, composed demeanor. It was as if this was just another part of his routine, another notch in his belt, another secret swept under the rug. The hypocrisy of it all gnawed at James. He had trusted that man with his soul, and now he realized that trust was nothing more than a cruel joke. The anger inside James simmered, but there was more, an overwhelming sense of betrayal. He could almost feel the air turning thick and suffocating with the weight of it. What could he do? The idea of confronting Sarah immediately seemed foolish. The words would get tangled in his throat. He needed to think this through, to make her feel the weight of her actions. But how? What could he do to make her understand the hurt he was feeling? James's thoughts began to turn darker, focusing on the idea of revenge, a way to punish both Sarah and Pastor Michael for what they had done. In his mind, revenge was not about simple retaliation. It was about ensuring they would suffer for what they had stolen from him, his dignity, his love, and the life he thought they would build together. He couldn't just let it go. He had to make them pay. As the days passed, the tension between James and Sarah grew. She tried to act as if nothing had happened, desperately clinging to normality. But James saw through her facade. Every time she smiled at him, it felt like a knife twisting in his gut. The laughter they once shared seemed like a distant memory. Every glance between them carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. Sarah had tried to talk to him, to apologize, but James shut her out. He needed time to think. Then as the days wore on, the plan began to take shape. The first step was to isolate Sarah. James knew she wouldn't be able to think clearly if he allowed her to maintain her usual routine. He couldn't risk her finding solace in the community, in the church, or in anyone else. He had to take away all the support systems she had relied on, starting with Pastor Michael. Without him, Sarah would be forced to confront the reality of her actions. But James couldn't just cut ties with Michael. That would raise questions, and he didn't want anyone looking too closely. The church, after all, was the center of this small town, and James knew that a scandal involving the pastor would be too explosive. So James bided his time. He started showing up to church more frequently, sitting quietly in the back pew, watching Pastor Michael from a distance. At first, Michael seemed oblivious to James's presence. He continued to preach his usual sermons, smiling warmly at the congregation, his air of authority unshaken. But James saw the cracks, the glances he exchanged with Sarah during service, the lingering handshakes, the overly familiar way he interacted with her when he thought no one was watching. It was all there, beneath the surface, little moments that spoke volumes. James's plan didn't involve violence at first. Instead, he wanted to break Pastor Michael's reputation, to destroy the trust that the community had placed in him. If he could tarnish Michael's image, expose him for what he truly was, it would be the ultimate form of revenge. The pastor would lose everything: his status, his influence, his power. Sarah would be left to deal with the consequences of her actions alone, and James could watch as her world came crashing down. It wasn't going to be easy, though. Pastor Michael was careful, calculated. He had too many connections in Pine Ridge, and the last thing James wanted was to be seen as someone out to ruin the town's beloved spiritual leader. But James knew that in a small town like this, rumors spread like wildfire, and even the smallest hint of scandal could bring someone to their knees. So, James began to watch and wait. Over the course of the next few weeks, James noticed something strange. Pastor Michael had begun acting differently around him. He was more distant, almost as if he knew James had discovered the secret. At first, James didn't think much of it, just the guilt of his own conscience eating away at him. But soon he realized Michael wasn't avoiding him out of guilt. He was avoiding him because he was afraid. James had become a threat, and the pastor knew it. One afternoon, as James was leaving the local hardware store, he caught a glimpse of Michael talking to Sarah. Their conversation was private, too private for James's liking. Sarah's face was flushed, her hands trembling as she spoke to the pastor, who was gesturing animatedly as if he were explaining something important. James felt his blood boil. The fact that Sarah was still seeking counsel from Michael after everything that had happened pushed him to the edge. He could feel the rage creeping in, but he reminded himself that his revenge had to be calculated. If he acted too soon, he could ruin everything. The church, the community, even Sarah, all of it would be lost. But if he waited, if he struck when they least expected it, he could ensure that they would feel the full force of his wrath. James began to gather information. He went to the local library and researched Pastor Michael's past. He spoke to a few people in the community who had been around for longer than he had, and what he found was disturbing. There were whispers about Michael's past, about rumors that had been brushed aside, forgotten, or hidden, allegations of inappropriate behavior, accusations that had never been fully investigated. James couldn't believe it. It seemed too perfect. The pastor's own history was a ticking time bomb, and all James had to do was light the fuse. One evening, after Sarah had gone to bed, James took the first step. He gathered a few old church newsletters, some handwritten letters that had been exchanged between Michael and members of the congregation, and a stack of old photographs. These documents contained enough information to paint a picture of Pastor Michael's true nature. Information that, if exposed, would ruin his credibility and his reputation. James wasn't finished, though. His next step was to involve Sarah in a way she wouldn't expect. He would make her an accomplice, force her to confront the situation head-on, and make her realize that the life they had once shared was gone. He knew she would try to distance herself from Michael, but it wouldn't matter. By the time she realized what he was doing, it would be too late. As James sat at the kitchen table, preparing his next move, he couldn't help but smile. This was only the beginning. Pastor Michael, Sarah, none of them knew what was coming, and when it hit, it would be impossible to recover. The plan was in motion, and there was no turning back now. James had always prided himself on his ability to remain calm, to control his emotions. But as the days wore on and the plan to take down Pastor Michael and Sarah moved forward, his patience was tested. There was a darkness inside him that he hadn't known existed, a shadow that grew longer with each passing day. The thrill of orchestrating the perfect revenge consumed him, and as the plan started to unfold, he began to feel like a puppet master, pulling strings, setting traps, and watching as everyone else danced to his tune. But with every step he took, James couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling at the back of his mind. What if everything goes wrong? What if he's not as in control as he thinks? For now, though, that was a worry for another day. He had to focus on the task at hand. Sarah was his first priority. She was the most fragile link in the chain, and he knew that in order for his revenge to be truly effective, he had to break her down completely. To do that, James started planting seeds of doubt in her mind. It wasn't hard. Sarah had always been an emotional person, sensitive to the slightest change in tone or behavior. He began to manipulate their interactions, small comments here and there, suggestions that he knew would rattle her. Every time they spoke, he made sure his words carried a hidden meaning. He hinted that Pastor Michael had more than just a spiritual interest in her, pushing her to remember the moments when Michael had seemed too familiar, too touchy-feely. Slowly but surely, Sarah began to question everything. Her unease grew with each passing day, and James could see the cracks in her facade widening. At the same time, James continued his investigation into Pastor Michael's past. What he discovered sent chills down his spine. The whispers around town, the rumors of inappropriate behavior, none of them had ever been substantiated, but James had uncovered enough to connect the dots. Pastor Michael had a history of exploiting vulnerable women in the congregation, using his position to manipulate and control them. It wasn't just Sarah who had fallen prey to his advances. There were others too. But no one had ever come forward, and the church had always protected him. James felt a sick satisfaction as he pieced together the puzzle. The pastor's perfect facade was starting to crumble. The more James learned about Michael, the more he realized that his revenge wasn't just about punishing Sarah. It was about destroying the man who had caused so much harm, the man who had betrayed the trust of an entire community. Michael had used his position as a man of God to hide behind a mask of righteousness. But James would rip that mask off, exposing the truth to the world. James knew that to truly break Michael, he needed something concrete, a smoking gun. So he began to dig deeper, reaching out to people who had once been close to the pastor. He found an old parishioner, a woman named Linda, who had been one of Michael's early victims. She was older now, living alone in a small house on the outskirts of Pine Ridge. James visited her under the pretense of offering help with some repairs around her home, and over the course of a few visits, he managed to gain her trust. One afternoon, as they sat in her modest kitchen, sipping tea, James broached the subject of Pastor Michael. "I know this may be difficult for you, but do you remember how Pastor Michael used to act around you?" James asked gently, watching her face closely for any sign of hesitation. Linda's eyes flickered with a mix of pain and anger. She lowered her voice, glancing around as if to ensure no one was listening. "I remember," she said, her voice trembling. "He was kind, always there when I needed someone to talk to. But then it became more than that. He would touch me, hold my hand for too long, make me feel like I was the only one who mattered. At first I thought it was just me, that maybe I was being too sensitive. But then I realized he was doing it to others too." James leaned in, eager to hear more. "Did anyone ever speak out about it?" Linda shook her head. "No one. No one ever said anything. He had a way of making people feel guilty for questioning him, and the church always protected him. They didn't want anyone to know what was really going on. I wasn't the only one. I know that now." James felt a surge of triumph. He had the proof he needed, proof that would destroy Pastor Michael's reputation and expose him for the predator he truly was. But it wasn't enough. He needed more. Linda, though willing to talk, was too scared to go public. She had been too traumatized, too broken by the experience to confront it head-on. James knew that if he wanted to bring Pastor Michael down, he would have to do it himself. Meanwhile, Sarah continued to grow more paranoid. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that James was no longer the man she had married. The coldness in his eyes, the way he watched her, it all felt different now. She tried to reach out to him, but he was distant, unyielding. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner, Sarah broke down. She asked him, her voice trembling with fear and confusion, "James, what's going on? You're not the same. I know I've hurt you, but please, just talk to me. Tell me what's going on. I need to understand." James looked at her, his expression unreadable. He had been preparing for this moment for weeks. This was the turning point. This was where he could push her over the edge. "You don't understand, Sarah," James said, his voice cold. "You made your choice, and now you have to live with the consequences." Sarah recoiled as though he had slapped her. "What do you mean by that? What consequences?" James stood up and walked toward the door. "You've betrayed me. You've betrayed everything we had. You think you can go on like nothing happened, but you can't. There's no coming back from this." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but James didn't care. He had made his decision. There would be no turning back now. He could see the fear in her eyes, the realization that her world was slipping away from her. But he didn't care. She had chosen her path. Now it was his turn to choose his. As Sarah sat on the couch, sobbing quietly, James turned away and began to write the final pieces of his plan. It was a late autumn evening when everything began to crack wide open. The days had grown colder, and the once vibrant town of Pine Ridge seemed to shrink under the weight of the secrets that had begun to surface. James could feel the tension in the air, a sort of foreboding that seemed to hang over every street, every corner. The entire town was unknowingly perched on the edge of a precipice, and James stood at the center of it all, pulling the strings. The house, once a home filled with warmth and laughter, now felt cold and hollow. Sarah had withdrawn entirely, her eyes haunted by the guilt of her actions, but still unable to comprehend the full extent of the consequences. She spent most of her time in silence, her eyes distant, as though she were lost in some faraway place. James, on the other hand, had become even more calculating, colder, his demeanor more detached than ever before. He went through the motions of daily life, work, chores, and small talk, but inside his mind was constantly plotting, scheming. Every conversation he had with Sarah felt like another step in his plan, a necessary part of the game. But there was one thing James hadn't anticipated, his own growing unease. As much as he had convinced himself that revenge was the answer, that exposing the truth about Pastor Michael and Sarah would finally bring him peace, a part of him began to question everything. Was this really what he wanted? Was it worth it to destroy everything he had once cared about? Every time he looked at Sarah, now broken and fragile, he felt a pang of doubt. She had betrayed him, yes, but she was still the woman he had once loved. Could he really go through with it? No, he told himself. There was no turning back now. The path he had chosen was the only one that would give him the satisfaction he craved. It wasn't about Sarah anymore. It wasn't about love or forgiveness. It was about justice, about making sure that Pastor Michael and Sarah paid for what they had done to him. The plan had been in motion for weeks, and James wasn't about to let it falter. His next step was crucial. He needed to make Sarah believe that the town was beginning to suspect her. He needed to push her to the brink, to make her feel the weight of her actions closing in on her. She had to believe that her world was about to fall apart, that she was about to lose everything. It was a Sunday morning when James made his move. The church was packed, as it always was on Sundays. The small town had a deep reverence for the house of God, and Pastor Michael was the central figure in the lives of most of Pine Ridge's residents. His sermons were powerful, and his ability to comfort and inspire people was unparalleled. But today there was an underlying tension in the air, a sense of unease that no one could quite explain. James arrived early, as he often did now, and sat in the back pew, his eyes scanning the room. Sarah hadn't arrived yet, which was unusual, but James wasn't concerned. He knew she would be there soon. What mattered was how he would use this moment to further his plan. The congregation settled into their seats, and the soft hum of quiet conversation filled the air as people greeted one another. James watched as Pastor Michael made his way to the pulpit, his usual confident stride betraying no sign of the secrets James had uncovered about him. But this time, there was something different in the air, a sense of finality, as though the moment of reckoning was approaching. As Pastor Michael began his sermon, James could see Sarah entering the church through the back doors. She seemed disoriented, nervous even, but she smiled at the familiar faces around her, trying to appear as though everything were normal. James's eyes never left her as she made her way to the front of the church and sat down, her posture stiff. She could feel the eyes of the congregation on her, but no one knew the truth. No one except for James and Pastor Michael. James was ready. After the service, as people filed out of the church, he quietly made his way to Pastor Michael's office. He had already set everything in motion. A few well-placed whispers would be enough to ensure that suspicion began to swirl around Sarah. He knew that once people started to talk, it would be impossible for her to escape the consequences. Pastor Michael was in his office, talking with a few church members. When he saw James, he nodded and excused himself from the group, motioning for James to come inside. "What's going on, James?" Michael asked, his tone calm but guarded. It was a familiar tone, one that used to be comforting, but now felt like an undercurrent of threat. James stepped inside, his face grim. "I need to talk to you about Sarah," he said, his voice low but firm. "I'm worried. The things people are saying, people are starting to notice. They're starting to question her." Pastor Michael's eyes narrowed, but he didn't say anything at first. James continued, carefully choosing his words. "She's been acting strange, like she's hiding something. People are beginning to gossip, and I don't think we can just ignore it. It won't be long before the whole town starts to wonder what's going on." Michael took a deep breath, leaning back in his chair. "You're overreacting," he said, but there was an edge to his voice now. "Sarah is a good woman. She's been through a lot recently. You need to trust her." James could hear the nervousness in Michael's voice, and he couldn't suppress the small smile that tugged at the corner of his mouth. He had him. Michael was worried, and that was exactly what James wanted. Trust her? James repeated, his voice hardening. You know as well as I do that she's been hiding something, and I can't let this go on any longer. People are going to find out, Michael. They're going to know what you've been doing. The silence in the room hung thick, like a weight in the air. Michael shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes darting around as though looking for a way out. But James wasn't about to let him escape. He had him cornered, and now was the time to drive the point home. You need to clean this up, Michael, James said, his voice icy. Or I will. Michael stood up, his face flushed with anger, but his hands trembled as he reached for his desk. You don't know what you're talking about, James. You need to leave. Now. But James didn't leave. Instead, he turned and walked out of the office, leaving Pastor Michael standing in the middle of the room, sweat beading on his forehead. As James left the church, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of satisfaction. His plan was coming together perfectly. At home, Sarah was waiting for him. She had changed into a simple dress and was sitting on the couch, looking as though she had been expecting him. But as James looked at her, he saw only the broken woman who had betrayed him. There would be no forgiveness for her, not yet, not until she had suffered the way he had. As he sat down beside her, he leaned in close and whispered, You think people don't know, don't you? You think you can hide it, but I see everything, and soon, so will everyone else. Sarah's face went pale, her lips trembling. James, please. But James didn't listen. He stood up and walked away, the weight of his actions pressing down on him, and yet in some dark corner of his mind, he felt a rush of power. He was in control now. The town would soon know the truth, but what James didn't realize was that someone was already watching. Someone was about to uncover the pieces of his dark plan, and the truth was about to surface in ways he couldn't imagine. Detective Claire Stevens had seen her fair share of small-town dramas. Pine Ridge, a quiet place nestled among the rolling hills of the Midwest, wasn't exactly known for its high-profile cases. The most excitement the small community typically saw came from the occasional bar fight or a missing dog. But when the call came in that someone had been murdered, Claire knew things were about to change. It wasn't an ordinary case, not by a long shot. A body had been found in the woods on the outskirts of town, barely a mile from the church. The victim was Pastor Michael, and the manner of his death was just as disturbing as the circumstances leading up to it. He had been shot twice in the chest, execution style. It looked like a targeted killing, but there was no obvious motive. No robbery, no sign of a struggle. It was a clean job, the kind of murder that suggested someone knew exactly what they were doing. Claire had arrived in Pine Ridge a week after the body was discovered. She had been assigned to investigate the case, and although the town was small, the pressure was enormous. People were already whispering about the pastor's past, about his untouchable status in the community. Now that he was dead, people were beginning to ask questions that no one had dared to ask while he was alive. Claire's first stop was the church, the very place where Michael had held sway for so many years. The grand wooden doors of the church stood as a stark contrast to the gruesome death inside. She stepped inside, taking in the old musty scent that clung to the pews and stained glass. The church was almost deserted except for a few elderly members of the congregation who were lighting candles or sitting in quiet prayer. As Claire moved toward the pastor's office, she couldn't shake the feeling that the church itself held secrets. The walls seemed to pulse with something dark, something hidden beneath the surface. It wasn't the kind of place where a murder would normally happen, but the more she thought about the pastor's life, the more she realized that maybe it wasn't so surprising after all. Pastor Michael had power, influence, and a reputation that could make or break people in this town. And now he was dead. She knocked softly on the door to his office, pushing it open when there was no answer. The room was immaculate, too immaculate. There were no personal touches, no family photos, nothing that would make the space feel like the office of a man who had lived and breathed in it for years. Instead, it looked sterile, almost clinical, as though Michael had always been a man of control, even in his private moments. Claire's eyes moved to a pile of paperwork on his desk, some of it still unopened. There was a certain coldness in the room, a suffocating air that made Claire's skin crawl. But then her eyes landed on something that would prove to be the key to unlocking the entire case. A collection of letters, neatly stacked, with one standing out from the rest. It was old, yellowed with age, but the handwriting on the front was unmistakable. For Michael, from Sarah. Claire froze. She had already gathered some preliminary information about Pastor Michael's relationship with Sarah, the wife of James Adams, the man whose reputation had also taken a hit in the wake of Michael's death. The whispers had been enough to pique her interest, but this letter, this tangible proof, was a game changer. It confirmed everything the town had only dared to whisper about. She carefully opened the letter, scanning the words written in a delicate script. The contents made her blood run cold. Michael, I know what I've done, but I cannot live with the guilt any longer. You said I would be free, that we would have everything we wanted. But I was wrong. I have betrayed James, and I am so sorry. Please help me. I don't know what to do anymore. I am lost. The letter was dated just a few days before Pastor Michael's death. The implications were staggering. It suggested a level of guilt and fear that could easily drive a person to do something desperate. Claire's mind started to piece together the puzzle. Sarah had been caught in a scandal, and the pastor had been involved. There was a motive here, but it wasn't immediately clear who stood to gain from the pastor's death. Claire knew she had to speak to Sarah. The next morning, Claire paid a visit to Sarah Adams's home. James wasn't there, which allowed Claire to speak with Sarah privately. The woman was pale, her face drawn and tired, as though the weight of her actions had worn her down completely. She was still shaken from the shock of Michael's death, but Claire could see the cracks in her calm exterior. There was something off about Sarah, something that didn't quite match up with her mourning. Mrs. Adams, Claire began gently, I know this is a difficult time, but I need to ask you about Pastor Michael. It's very important. Sarah's eyes darted to the door as if considering making a run for it. But then she seemed to collect herself, the mask of composure settling back into place. What do you want to know? Sarah's voice trembled slightly, betraying her calm facade. Anything you can tell me about your relationship with the pastor? Claire pressed. And whether you or your husband had any reason to be upset with him in the days leading up to his death. Sarah looked down, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve. I don't know what you mean, she said weakly. Pastor Michael was a good man. He helped me through a lot of things. She paused as if weighing her words carefully. I don't understand why anyone would want to hurt him. Claire studied Sarah closely. There was more to this story, she could feel it. I understand, she said, but I'm afraid that there are things we need to discuss. Your relationship with Pastor Michael, it's part of the investigation now. There are letters that suggest you were closer than you should have been. Sarah's face drained of color. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She looked as though she were on the verge of a breakdown. Mrs. Adams, Claire said softly, I know this is hard, but if you want to help with the investigation, now is the time to be honest. I need to know the truth. At that moment, Sarah's defenses crumbled. Tears began to spill down her cheeks as she finally spoke. I didn't mean for it to happen, she sobbed. I was confused. I didn't know what I was doing. But James caught us, and I never wanted this to go so far. I thought if we kept it a secret, everything would be fine. But now, she paused, looking up at Claire with haunted eyes. Now Pastor Michael's dead, and I don't know what to do. Claire's instincts told her that Sarah knew more than she was letting on. The question was, what role did Sarah play in the pastor's death? Was she an innocent bystander caught in a storm of her own making? Or was she more involved than she realized? The investigation had taken a sudden turn. What had started as a murder investigation was now delving deep into a world of secrets, lies, and betrayal. Secrets that, once revealed, would change everything. Detective Claire Stevens spent the next few days piecing together the shattered fragments of the case. What started as a simple murder investigation had quickly become a sprawling web of lies, betrayals, and hidden truths. She was no longer just investigating the murder of Pastor Michael. She was uncovering a twisted tale of deceit that had been carefully concealed behind closed doors for far too long. Sarah Adams, while emotionally distraught, had made it clear that the relationship between her and Pastor Michael was no accident. There was guilt in her eyes as she spoke of their brief affair, and Claire could tell that she wasn't just guilty of betraying her husband, James, but also of holding some secret knowledge about the murder. Yet there was still something about Sarah's story that didn't add up. Was she just an unwilling participant in a tragic love affair gone wrong? Or was she more involved in the events that led to the pastor's death? Claire knew the next step was crucial. She needed to understand James Adams' role in this whole mess. From Sarah's tearful confession, it was clear that James had caught her with Michael. But what had happened afterward? What was the connection between James and the murder? James had remained largely quiet throughout the investigation, not offering any major clues to the authorities. He was a quiet man, reserved and always composed. He didn't seem like the type who would murder someone in cold blood. Yet there was a strange coldness about him, a sense of distance that Claire couldn't ignore. People who knew him described him as a loving husband, though it was clear that his marriage to Sarah had taken a turn for the worse after her infidelity. James was also heavily involved in the church, though his relationship with Pastor Michael appeared to be neutral at best. But Claire needed more than just neutral relationships. She needed evidence. One afternoon, Claire visited James at the small house on Oak Street. He answered the door quickly, his expression unreadable as always. He welcomed her inside without question, offering her a seat in the living room. "Detective Stevens," James said, his voice smooth but carrying a subtle edge. "How can I help you today?" Claire settled into the chair, watching him closely. He had a way of remaining perfectly still, like a man who knew how to control his emotions. But underneath the calm exterior, Claire could see the tension. His knuckles were white as he gripped the arm of the chair, and his jaw clenched when he spoke about his wife. "I'm hoping you can help me understand more about your relationship with Pastor Michael," Claire began, choosing her words carefully. "I know this is difficult, but it's important. You and he were close, weren't you?" James hesitated before answering, his eyes shifting for the briefest of moments. "We were," he finally said, his voice low. "But that was a long time ago. Pastor Michael and I had some disagreements over the years. He had his way of doing things and I had mine. But I respected him as a man of faith." Claire nodded, continuing to observe him closely. "I understand. But there are some things about your wife's relationship with him that have come to light. I'm sure you're aware of what I mean." James' eyes narrowed slightly, but he said nothing. His lips tightened and the tension in the room increased. "I know what you're thinking, Detective," James said at last, his tone colder now. "But I didn't kill Michael. I didn't want him dead. I just wanted the truth to come out." Claire leaned forward. "What truth, James? What do you mean?" He took a deep breath, his eyes flicking to the window as though searching for the right words. "I caught Sarah with him. It wasn't just once. It had been going on for months, maybe even longer. I had suspected something, but when I saw them together, it was like my world came crashing down. There it was, finally a crack in his carefully constructed facade." James was angry. He had been hurt, deeply. But what was he saying now? Could he be hiding something? "You're telling me you found them together," Claire said slowly. "But what did you do afterward?" James looked away, his expression blank. "I confronted Michael. I wanted him to admit it, to confess everything to me and Sarah. But he was evasive. He wouldn't give me a straight answer. It was like he thought he was untouchable, like no one could ever expose him." Claire's mind raced. "And what happened next? Did you and Michael get into a confrontation?" James's eyes darkened, and for a moment Claire could see the flash of anger behind his calm mask. "I went to the church that night. He was there praying, or so he said. I thought I could talk to him, really talk to him. But when I arrived, he was already gone. I was too late." Claire observed his reaction closely. It seemed genuine, but there was something about James's story that didn't fit. Why had he gone to the church that night? Was it truly to confront Michael? Or was there something more to his presence there? "Did you ever get the chance to speak to him after that night?" Claire asked, her tone more probing now. James hesitated, and Claire saw the slightest flicker of guilt cross his face before he answered. "No, I didn't. I wanted to. But I never saw him again after that night," he said, his voice a little too calm. A little too rehearsed. Claire took careful note of the discrepancy. There was more to this story. She just had to figure out what James was hiding. As the days passed, Claire delved deeper into the evidence. She revisited Sarah's confession and the letter she had written to Michael, which detailed their secret relationship. There was something strange in the way Sarah spoke of Michael, almost as though she was trying to convince herself that it was just a passing affair, but it didn't quite ring true. The guilt she expressed was real, but there was also a sense of manipulation, a quiet undertone that hinted she was playing a larger game. In the meantime, Claire spoke to other people in the community, neighbors, co-workers, and friends who had known James and Sarah over the years. What she learned painted an even more complicated picture. James had always been a man who kept to himself, but he was also fiercely protective of his wife. People described him as a loving husband, but there were whispers of a darker side to him. Some even suggested that his anger could be frightening when provoked. As Claire dug deeper, she learned that James had been more than just a bystander in his wife's affair. He had been a man on a mission. He was desperate for answers, for closure, and he had been the one to demand that the truth come to light. But had he crossed the line? Was he truly innocent, or had he taken matters into his own hands? The next breakthrough came when Claire received a tip from an anonymous source. The source claimed to have seen James leaving the church the night Michael was killed. The timeline matched. This was the missing piece of the puzzle. Claire's instincts told her she was close. James was hiding something, but the question remained, had he killed Pastor Michael in a fit of rage, or was there a larger conspiracy at play? The investigation was nearing its breaking point. Claire knew the truth was out there, but it was buried under layers of lies and half-truths. It was up to her to pull the pieces together and bring justice to Pastor Michael's death. The town of Pine Ridge had not been the same since Pastor Michael's murder. Whispers of betrayal, deceit, and scandal had swept through its narrow streets, forever changing the way people saw each other. For Detective Claire Stevens, the case had become a personal obsession. The more she dug into the lives of James and Sarah Adams, the more tangled and mysterious the web became. It was clear that something had gone terribly wrong. But now, as the investigation neared its end, Claire was ready to uncover the truth, no matter how dark it might be. The anonymous tip about James being seen leaving the church the night Michael died had been the final key she needed. It tied James directly to the scene of the crime, and while there was no physical evidence linking him to the murder, it was enough to warrant a confrontation. Claire couldn't ignore the nagging suspicion that James had something to do with it, and now she had the chance to prove it. James Adams sat in the small interrogation room at the Pine Ridge police station, his face set in a stoic expression. His eyes were tired, hollow even, as though the weight of the investigation was finally starting to take its toll on him. Claire could see that he was no longer the calm, composed man he had once been. His world had unraveled, and now he was at the mercy of the very system he had once trusted. Claire sat across from him, her gaze unwavering. She had studied his every move, his every word. There was something about James that seemed to shift when he spoke of Michael, something that told her he knew far more than he was letting on. This was the moment she had been waiting for. She needed him to crack. "James," Claire began, her voice firm but compassionate, "you've been very cooperative up until now, but there are still things we need to address. You were seen leaving the church the night Pastor Michael was killed. The timeline matches up, and we know you were there. So I need to ask you, what happened that night?" James didn't flinch. He kept his eyes fixed on the table, not meeting her gaze. For a moment, the silence between them stretched. Then, with a slow exhale, he finally spoke. "I didn't kill Michael," he said, his voice steady but hollow. "I would never kill anyone, not even him." Claire leaned in, her eyes narrowing. She had heard the same words countless times before, but she wasn't ready to let him off the hook just yet. "But you were there that night. You went to the church to confront him, didn't you?" "You were angry, James." "I can see it in your eyes," Claire pressed, her voice gentle but insistent. "I know what it's like to feel betrayed, to feel like everything you've worked for is slipping away." James looked up at her then, his eyes clouded with emotion. For the first time, Claire saw the raw vulnerability behind the mask. There was more to this story than he had been willing to admit. "I went there to talk to him," James said, his voice breaking slightly. "I thought if I could get him to confess, to admit what he'd done to Sarah, maybe I could fix things. Maybe I could save my marriage. But when I saw him, I knew it was too late. He didn't care. He didn't care about me or Sarah or anyone." James paused, his face contorting in anger. He was smug. He acted like nothing was wrong, like he was untouchable. I I just wanted him to feel what I was feeling, to know what it was like to lose everything. But I never meant for it to go this far. Claire felt her heart race as she listened to his words. There was guilt there, no doubt, but there was also something else, a sense of denial, as though James was still trying to justify his actions. "So what happened, James?" Claire asked quietly, her tone softening. "What happened after you confronted him?" James looked down at his hands, his fingers twitching nervously. He swallowed hard, clearly struggling with the memory. "He laughed at me," James whispered. "He told me I was being dramatic, that it wasn't a big deal. He said Sarah was just a weak woman, that I was better off without her. And then he said that I should let go, that I should stop being so possessive. That's when I snapped." Claire felt the weight of his words. She had heard confessions before, but this one hit differently. James wasn't just angry at Michael. He was angry at everything he had lost. His marriage, his pride, his faith. The anger had been building for months, and Michael's death seemed like the only way to release it. "I didn't mean to kill him," James continued, his voice trembling. "I just wanted him to stop laughing at me, to stop acting like he was above everything. I don't even remember pulling the trigger." There it was, the moment Claire had been waiting for. James Adams had not planned to kill Pastor Michael, but in a moment of overwhelming anger and frustration, he had done it anyway. The execution-style shooting had been a crime of passion, not premeditated murder. But it didn't make it any less tragic. The final moments of the investigation were both cathartic and painful. Claire spent hours processing the confession, gathering the final pieces of the puzzle, and compiling her report. James had been arrested, but the case wasn't as clear-cut as it had initially seemed. Pastor Michael had been a powerful figure in Pine Ridge, and his death had left a ripple effect throughout the community. Many would mourn him, others would criticize his actions. But in the end, it didn't matter. The truth had come to light. But even as the case closed, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more beneath the surface. The pastor's death had been a symptom of a much deeper issue, one that was rooted in the darkness of human nature. James and Sarah had been the catalyst, but they were far from the only ones affected. The web of deceit, betrayal, and anger that had spiraled out of control had left scars that would never fully heal. Claire's final report was a long one. She detailed the murder, the affair, the motives, and the confessions. She documented everything with painstaking precision. It wasn't just about the death of Pastor Michael. It was about the unraveling of an entire community's carefully constructed image. Pine Ridge had been hiding secrets for years, and now they were all exposed. As Claire closed the file and sat back in her chair, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. Justice had been served, but there would be no easy answers for the people of Pine Ridge. The truth had come with a price, and the scars of the past would linger long after the case was closed. In the end, there was no real closure, only the cold certainty that people's darkest desires and secrets could never remain hidden forever.